All right, folks. Welcome to the October edition of the CodeX Community of Practice. Today is the 31st of October, and we've got an interesting program lined up today with a focus on molecular tumor board brought to you by Yuri and Bob. And then we'll have a shorter presentation on symptoms implementation guide by our friend Lisa. I'm going to get the party started, however, with a quick introduction to HL7 CodeX for folks who may be new, and for the benefit of folks who watch this subsequently as a recording. So I'm just going to start my slideshow and then choose desktop 1. All right. Can I get a verbal that you can see my slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. So first off, for folks who may not be aware, HL7 is the world's leading standards development organization for health data standards and health data interoperability. They are the holders of, the publishers of HL7 V2 and V3 and CDA and HL7 FHIR, all of which form the backbone for health data exchange in the world today. Within that standard development organization, HL7 has formed these 8, and more recently a 9th, accelerators. And an accelerator is effectively a community that's gathered together to address healthcare challenges in a particular domain. Each of these accelerators, these are our accelerator siblings, as it were, are each focused on a particular set of challenges in healthcare. So for instance, our friends in Vulcan are really interested in research data and how do we get clinical data into the hands of researchers. Our friends in Gravity are working on social determinants of health. Our friends in Da Vinci are working on payer data exchange and so on. Our focus at CodeX is on clinical medicine, specifically on internal medicine. And it's the only clinically focused HL7 accelerator. We were born in the field of oncology, and we've since evolved and broadened our focus. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we started in oncology. Our first set of projects were all based on a data standard called MCode, which was built by MITRE and ASCO. And CodeX was sort of grew from that foundation and started with a strong focus in oncology. We've since evolved and added cardiovascular and genomics as new domains. But we are all one family here in CodeX. We have one membership, we have one organizational structure and governance and process and so on. Now, within each of these domains, we have projects. Now, we call these projects use cases. Effectively, each one of these use cases is a problem set that we've identified, a group of members who've come together to address that challenge. And in many cases, there are work products, implementation guides, white papers, all sorts of resources that we generate that are intended to help solve that problem. This list is very dynamic. There's always new use cases that are coming into the world. There are older use cases that we've concluded, which roll off. And so this list changes on a regular basis. We're going to be hearing today mostly about stuff in the right side of this slide, in the Genomics domain, which is where the molecular tumor board project fits. And you'll hear lots about that from our featured presentation. I would be remiss if I didn't point to our membership, because HL7 CodeX is only as good as the organizations that participate, the perspectives that they bring, the resources that they offer in terms of data, in terms of skilled personnel, in terms of sometimes financial resources that all make CodeX possible. And so this is an organization that is constantly seeking new membership. And so if you're interested in learning more about CodeX, if you're interested in participating in CodeX, we'd love to add you to our list of invested members. And with that, I think I will stop sharing my screen, and I will introduce our next speakers. I'll allow them to introduce themselves more formally, but I am very pleased to welcome Yuri Quintana and Dr. Bob Dolin, or I should say Dr. Yuri Quintana and Dr. Bob Dolin, as speakers who are each invested as leaders in the molecular tumor board space and are eager to share the work that they've done and the recent milestone that they've crossed as a team. And so with that, big round of applause. We welcome to the stage Yuri and Bob. I think Yuri is going to present first, so over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I lead the Division of Clinical Informatics at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and we are a research division that we've been around for 55 years, developing new methodologies, platforms, evaluating what works and what doesn't, and publishing those ideas and contributing to standards group where possible. We have been working for a long time on developing software to help clinicians compare data and use it in clinical consultation systems, and more recently with molecular tumor boards. This platform is called Alicanto and has been developed since 2019 and became operational in 2020. It's been used by hundreds of people at our Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Cancer Center with over 2,000 clinical consultations. We also run a network called DCA Network, which is a coalition of academics, private sector, private and sector and nonprofit groups and patients and governments who come together to discuss challenging topics. We do this through webinars, symposiums, and we have working groups. And one of those working groups is focusing on how do we scale molecular tumor board. So this platform helps not only educate about the knowledge that you need to be able to interpret the content on tumor board meetings. So it has an online learning platform, but it also has a clinical area where you can securely store those clinical case studies. And in those clinical secure areas, you can upload images, the medical history, and the questions that people want to ask about that. You can ask those questions asynchronously. There are also online meetings that happen, and those are recorded. And what we're trying to do is make that content more accessible to other people and add tools that allow you to search for similar patients and other external sources. Here you see conceptually how it works. Publicly, you can view content without logging on. You can have some content that's only available for education for certain types of communities. Then you have the virtual tumor boards for online meetings. And finally, we want to use that such that if somebody wants to be consulted across 2 hospitals, it might start as a virtual tumor board, but then they'll transfer that patient, including all the multimodal data that's been collected, to the next center that will be treating that patient. So we've built this over the last couple of years, getting inputs from different users and improving the interface over time. And we've built a repository of over 2,000 cases. There are other molecular tumor boards around the world as well. And one of the sort of missed opportunities is that we're not learning from each other, or even the cases that we have had, it's sometimes hard to go back and refer to other cases. So how do we index that content and make it more useful? Here you see a high-level interface that we have, which sort of describes how you can enter that information and classify the type of cancer. You can add questions to different specialty groups. What you're seeing here are just fictitious data, just for an example, but you can then click and start to see the images. And one of the areas that we started to develop more and more detail is how to start documenting the cancer variants. Here you can be able to create communities of different groups, and then you're able to see all the cases within the communities of that you're doing. So our next phase, we've been working with different people to see how the data that we collect across our various tumor boards can be consistently collected and how we can share it across centers. I think for the most difficult to treat cases, no one has all the experts that you need, and we're going to need to be able to share data and share expertise across that. And I think this is an important place where HL7 can help contribute to how we evolve the software in a way that it's standards-based and will make it easier to aggregate that data, share it, and as we refer patients between centers, it can be carried over. I think as we collect this data, I think there's also the opportunity to do federated searches. Has anyone else seen a patient with these similar types of cancer variants and what information is available. I think this will become increasingly more important because cancer is becoming more complex, not less complex, and the number of medications and the types of special regimens that each patient will need to be able to survive will become more and more complex. So we do need to be able to aggregate this data. We need better tools, and I think standards will play an enormous part of that. Here you see conceptually how this could work. Each site would run its own virtual tumor board software. It could be different vendors, but the idea is that they have to have a common architecture such that when you export that data and you want to share it in de-identified ways or make it accessible for a federated search, there are some common APIs and common fields and common data structures that you can share. And this is where HL7 and the Genomics comes into play, because we really want to sort of improve how that data is standardized and collected to allow that kind of strong type of searching. We've had the privilege to work with Elimu and their fantastic team and looking at how we can evolve our front-end systems with their back-end systems to store genomic data, such that you can then, for specific variants, be able to annotate them, be able to search across them, and improve the way in which we can report to other groups novel variants that arrive. So that's sort of the use case, and I'm going to pass it over to Bob, who will then talk more about some of the technical things that are needed to make this all work. Thank you.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? Thank you for that. I just think it's really cool to see firsthand that these molecular tumor boards are living, breathing entities that are currently being used today to treat patients. And what we're finding is that a lot of the challenges that Yuri was talking about are potentially amenable to standards-based solutions. So based on that, we formed the molecular tumor board use case under CodeX. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the molecular tumor board use case, maybe our long-term vision, where do we want to go, and our more immediate trajectory over the next 1 to 2 years. But before I do that, I'm not sure how many people on the call are even familiar with the FHIR Genomics standard. And so I wanted to just digress for 1 minute just to introduce you to what's in this FHIR Genomics standard. And I don't know, just for interest, at the crux of a somatic report that's communicated in FHIR, this is really the crux of that report right here. We have FHIR profiles for communicating variants, haplotypes, genotypes or diplotypes, and molecular biomarkers. And then we also have profiles for the various types of annotations or implications of those patient findings. So we can talk about diagnostic implications. For instance, this variant increases your risk of this type of cancer. We can talk about therapeutic implications. Because your tumor has this particular variant, this particular drug is predicted to be sensitive or predicted to be resistant. We can talk about molecular consequences of the patient findings, such as this particular variant. We can tell it's likely to introduce a stop codon and be a truncating variant. And we can include arbitrary annotations. And these arbitrary annotations are in part useful to display on a molecular tumor board screen, but they're also being used possibly even more heavily by evolving decision support algorithms that can consume these annotations and calculate, for instance, the risk that a particular novel variant is oncogenic. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is the crux of the FHIR Genomics report. And this crux is kind of then packaged up within the genomics report, which has all of the genomic findings and the related genomic implications. We also include in the report, or also the standard has provisions for the inclusion of details about the genomic study. What was studied, how did the test go, what portions succeeded, what portions failed, and also recommended actions. So anyhow, that's about all I'm going to say about the FHIR genomic standard, but hopefully that just kind of gives you a mental image of where we've already gone. We're in, I think, version 3 of the standard now, so it's getting pretty mature. So let's turn now, though, to the molecular tumor board use case. I think we started this, I don't know, a year or so ago. It's been a pretty interesting journey. And because this is the community of practice call, I'm not sure how many folks on the call know the CodeX use case development methodology. These new use cases, when they come into CodeX, they first come into CodeX in what's called the ideation phase, which is we have this idea that a molecular tumor board might be a groovy thing. Let's explore it. If we conclude based on the ideation phase, yep, I think we should go forward. We then next move into a phase called the discovery phase. And during that discovery phase, we do outreach, we talk to a lot of people, we get clarity on a lot of these use cases. And at that point, if we've determined that we want to go forward, we then go to the CodeX steering committee and we propose entering into planning phase, followed by execution phase. And planning phase is where we take all of the ideas that we generated during discovery phase, and we literally synthesize them into a formal project plan that balances our huge appetite that reflects our vision with the practical realities of who are the people that came to the table to actually help us do the work. And so, while I'm going to show you a pretty lofty vision, when you see our actual roadmap, it's quite possible you're going to look at that roadmap and say, oh my gosh, it's going to take 2 years till we do that. And my response is going to be, well, given our current resources, but if you want to help us accelerate, sure, join us. We'll go faster. We can go as fast as we need to. So the molecular tumor board use case right now is in planning phase. We're hardening our roadmap. We're hardening our project plan. We'll go back to the CodeX steering committee. We're anticipating to go back to the CodeX steering committee in January with our planning phase, our project plan, and propose that we enter into execution phase. And so why did we do this? Why is Yuri putting all of the effort in to build Alicanto and build the network, and why are so many of us have growing interest? And by the way, my background is internal medicine. I'm not an oncologist, but I've been doing internal medicine and doing informatics for a long time. So why are we doing this? Well, number one, there's growing recognition of the value of a molecular tumor board. Clinicians just can't keep up with the literature. They just don't know what therapies are available sometimes, and probably this is going to be more in the future. You remember in the early days of email, it was like, oh, this is fun, you get an email, but nowadays you're like inundated with emails, and the focus has completely shifted from too few to too many. And probably in the not too distant future, this is going to be the same case as our knowledge bases grow and as the volume of data comes in. We're no longer going to be scratching our heads saying, gosh, do we have one treatment option? But rather, we're going to be scratching our heads saying, how do we prioritize amongst the several treatment options? And the other thing we can do within the molecular tumor board is we can deploy all kinds of kind of groovy clinical decision support algorithms. And I'll show you, I think, towards the end, how we implemented ClinVar's oncogenicity prediction pipeline. And we can deploy that now in molecular tumor board, and we can develop these clinical decision support algorithms as open source and publish them in HL7 format. The other thing is we can suggest potential clinical trials. And here, this to me is kind of interesting because oftentimes sites have local clinical trials. And so even if you get back a rich, robust, curated lab report, that lab report doesn't necessarily link variants to your institution's specific clinical trials. And so a lot of people are developing software to kind of guide the clinician in these various ways. And when you look at what folks are trying to do, and when you look at what Yuri's trying to do, you realize that, we're not, in this use case, we're not trying to build a molecular tumor board. We're not trying to build variant annotation pipelines, but really what we're trying to do is say across all of the efforts towards developing molecular tumor boards, what of those problems are amenable to a standards-based solution? How do we ensure that the data that you need to drive your molecular tumor board can be adequately fed? What's the correct way in which we should deliver variants to a molecular tumor board application? What's the correct way that we should deliver knowledge to a molecular tumor board application? And it turns out that FHIR-based standards can provide solutions for a number of the challenges faced by the community that's developing molecular tumor boards, molecular tumor board applications. We can dramatically speed up variant curation. If you know that you typically go to these 10 websites to look up your variants, most of this these days can now be automated. And in fact, the knowledge representation standards are evolving on the GA4GH standards organization side. So our ability to automatically curate variants and present that and shave off time, not only are we finding it to be positive, but there's also a growing body of literature showing that we're cutting variant curation time at least in half, if not more. We know that genomic data are voluminous and complex, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because we're now finding that while I may send you the curated lab report, and we've worked with some of these labs who are developing these curated lab reports, and these are like some brilliant scientists who are doing this work. But despite that, what we're seeing and what the literature is supporting is that in as many as 20% of cases, the curated lab report doesn't have quite everything that the clinical team would like in order to derive their therapeutic implications. And then if they go back to the raw genomic data, such as the VCF file, they gain additional insight that actually benefits the patient. And I hadn't realized until just recently that the proportion of patients that potentially benefit from a more robust strategy that allows decision support based on the patient's whole genome is as high as 20% of cases. And then to Yuri's point, data silos in P discovery. So the more that we can standardize the type of data that's flowing into the molecular tumor board, or the outcome or the outcomes of the molecular tumor board, the more we can standardize that data, the more we can gather and aggregate all that data for a learning health system and for ongoing research. So this is what inspired us to kind of start this project. I want to dig into these problems just a little bit more to get us all, I guess, kind of on the same page. Variant curation is time consuming. We did some work under the ONC Sync for Genes project a couple of years ago, where we explored what it would take to automatically annotate somatic variants or germline variants. And we found, I don't think this is going to surprise anyone, we found that some variants are easy to annotate and some are hard, if not impossible, to annotate. And so one of the I'll get back to the plan, but this is one of the discoveries, is that variant curation can be very time consuming. We can automate it to some extent, but there's a lot of opportunities for advancing the science of dynamic variant annotation so that we can continue to automatically or automate the return of relevant annotations for a patient's variants. Then we also found that there's this big data bottleneck. There's a big genomic data bottleneck. And, the lab is generating rich amounts of highly structured data, although the data that the lab is collecting is in formats that are typically unfamiliar to clinical informaticists, a little bit difficult for clinical informaticists to leverage. And rather than sending this richly structured data to the EHR, historically what's happened is we've taken the key bits of this, the relevant clinical findings, the actionable findings, if you will, and we boiled them down into a PDF report. And that PDF report is then sent to the EHR, where it's reviewed and then subsequently lost. And what we've done with the FHIR Genomics reporting standard is we've said, well, that PDF report, we can come up with a FHIR representation of that report. And we've done that, and there's been quite a number of tests done under Genomics, particularly in the data exchange use case. We now have, for instance, Tempus sending FHIR encoded reports over to Epic, where Epic is parsing these reports. And this is all, pilot type stuff, but we're now seeing the communication of this data. But the challenge is this is still a subset of the data. This might be 1% of this rich data. And studies are now indicating that as many as 20% of cases, there's data in here that would alter clinical management. And so the question is, how do we get to it? How do we expose this data? And so one of the things we did in the FHIR Genomics standard was we said, well, let's not just standardize the report that goes from the lab to the EHR, but let's also envision a genomic data repository that stores not just the curated report that came across the wire, but what about the non-FHIR genomic data, the VCF data or the microarray data or what have you? And so we came up with a standards-based strategy whereby we could put even the non-FHIR genomic data into a repository, and we developed a set of APIs, which we call FHIR Genomics Operations. And these FHIR Genomics Operations encapsulate the complexity of the data and the knowledge inside the repository. But not only do they encapsulate the complexity, but because these are operations and not just basic FHIR search, what these operations afford you is the ability to encapsulate data normalization, but also they can enact dynamic variant annotation. So for instance, from the Tumor Board application, we may want to say, gosh, my patient has all of these mutations in EGFR. What I really want to know is which one of them are clinically actionable. And here within the server, because we've dissociated knowledge from variants, we can dynamically associate the individual patient's variants with the knowledge that we have in store, and we can return them back in FHIR format to the molecular tumor board so that the clinician has up-to-date annotations for all of those variants to guide their therapy decisions. So the FHIR Genomics Operations were developed specifically to allow access to the patient's whole genome, and it attempts to solve these kind of key problems. How do you deal with this data volume? How would you expect an EHR to deal with VCF files? How would you deal with data complexity? How would you deal with the fact that, what would you even do if I gave a VCF file to an oncologist? What would they even do? How would they search it? These are humongous files. And then rapid knowledge evolution, which is important not only for molecular tumor boards, but also comes into play for other types of genomic use cases. In particular, what comes to mind is rare disease discovery, where we know from the literature that patients with rare diseases, when they're reanalyzed every 6 months or every year, a high proportion of cases are, if you will, diagnosed or solved that couldn't previously be solved. So that's what these APIs are attempting to do. And then to Yuri's point, data silos impede discovery. And so this, if you will, is I guess a vision of where we want to go with molecular tumor board. And I think many of us would like to be there tomorrow. But the next slide, when I show you our roadmap, it's like all the excitement in this slide is going to be like, oh crap, it's going to take that long to get there. But again, that's what this use case is all about. And that's why the work we're doing with molecular tumor board isn't being done in some arbitrary committee in HL7. It's being done specifically in CodeX, because CodeX is an accelerator. And so if we believe in this vision, and if we're not happy with the timeline on the roadmap, the nice thing is within CodeX, we have an opportunity, we have a lot of opportunities where we can speed things up. And when you look at this picture, which I kind of sort of think of right now as our long-term vision of really where we want to go, there's multiple molecular tumor board applications that are evolving, and what we're trying to do is kind of tease out what are the challenges that all of these groups are facing that are amenable to standards-based solutions. But we also want to, for instance, enable the learning health model. And what we're finding is that molecular tumor boards, when they discover novel variants, it's possible to submit novel variants directly to some of these knowledge bases, such as ClinVar. ClinVar now has a crowdsourced API that allows for the submission of somatic variants. But we're also seeing, because these molecular tumor boards now, given the FHIR genomics operations, because we've enabled dynamic annotation, as soon as new knowledge is pushed into these knowledge bases, that knowledge is immediately available for someone else in someone else's app. And so on the right-hand side, we're trying to kind of sort of illustrate the learning health model, that in proof of concept, this is working beautifully now, but we're now trying to harden it and really get it out there, if you will. On the other side, we see that we can provide solutions not only for the storage of the curated report within the EHR, but these omics repositories can store the VCF file, can store the patient's full data set, and whether patients have data resident in their EHR or in their omics repository, we've now seen, just based on regular FHIR queries or more advanced FHIR genomics operations, that we can harness any of this data for use in the molecular tumor board. Not only that, a lot of these omics repositories, and we've, for instance, experimented with omics repositories built on Amazon's Health Omics platform. It's quite possible to build omics repositories that are federated. So given proper security and clearance, it's now theoretically possible and demonstratively possible in our proof of concept work that multiple EHRs using multiple molecular tumor boards can not only be part of a learning health system model, but can also be leveraging advanced molecular data to drive their applications, while also storing that molecular data in federated repositories that further enable research and add yet another layer to the learning health system model, if you will. So this is kind of where we want to go. And when we look at all of this, again, I'll just remind folks, we're in planning phase. So between now and the end of the year, our primary focus is to harden this roadmap. And I would say, if any of you on the call look at this roadmap and aren't happy with it, well, I would love to talk to you. Hit me up, or hit BBO up, or hit Yuri up, or come to one of our calls. Because what's going to happen is, by the end of this year, we will have hardened this roadmap, we'll have gone to the steering committee, and we'll literally be starting on these projects. And so the two sub-projects that we'll start on most immediately upon transitioning from planning phase to execution phase is the data element dictionary project, which is being led. I don't know if Damien's here. Damien was one of the engineers who worked on the Navify molecular tumor board application. And the scope of the data element dictionary project is broader than just those data elements that would be displayed on the screen for clinicians. We're also going to be tracking data elements that are, if you will, metadata about the tumor board that are required for regulatory reporting. But also, we're going to be investigating data elements that are used to drive clinical decision support. And I'll talk to you, I think, in a minute about where we're going with the oncogenicity prediction algorithms. And there's 10 or 15 different annotations that come into play in order to predict the oncogenicity of a novel variant. And so what we're going to try to do in this project in the first 6 months of our execution is begin to catalog data elements in those 3 categories. And then also the capabilities of communicating variant annotation information in the FHIR Genomics standard. I would say it's very good. It's particularly good for communicating diagnostic implications and therapeutic implications. But what we're now finding is that there's a boatload of other annotations that may be of relevance in some cases, if only to drive decision support algorithms. And so this project here is basically preparing a proposal for the HL7 Clinical Genomics Committee to enhance the way that we communicate variant annotations or that we query for variant annotations in the FHIR Genomics standard. And so what we'll be doing here is working on this proposal collectively, and then the CodeX community will then work with HL7 on this proposal to get it implemented into the next iteration of the FHIR Genomics Implementation Guide. So we'll do this in draft over the first 6 months, and then we anticipate about 6 months of testing. You know, did we get all the data elements right? Did we get all of the annotations right? And the testing is literally moving data from point A to point B. And we anticipate that as part of that testing, we're going to realize, oh, we missed a data element, or there was ambiguity in this element, or maybe this proposal didn't quite hit the mark. And so after connectathon testing, we anticipate revising the data element dictionary and hardening this proposal and finally submitting this to HL7, where we'll then work with HL7 to get it incorporated into the next version of the standard. Then finally, even though a lot of people are primarily interested in clinical decision support and molecular tumor board applications, what we wanted to do was take our first year and a half. I mean, really, the rate at which we go here will just depend on how many people come to the table to help us with this. What we'll do here is, now that we are pretty comfortable that the data elements necessary are flowing and that the annotations that are necessary are flowing, we anticipate after about a year going into our clinical decision support phase, where we're going to, we anticipate building public clinical decision support rules and making them available. So again, this doesn't necessarily address everything in here, but when we looked at this picture, we said, well, what are some of the foundational pieces that we need to start with? And this is what we came up with. Finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about an example of where we might go with clinical decision support, because these days, what talk would be complete if I didn't mention AI, right? So, so as not to be remiss, I want to first show people, oh, here we go. So, ClinVar will accept crowdsourced submission of somatic variants now, in addition to germline variants. And when you do submit a somatic variant to ClinVar, this is the framework that they want to be used in order to classify the oncogenicity of that variant. So if I discover my patient has this new variant in EGFR that no one's ever seen before, I can run it through this framework. And if I say, you know what, I think that this is driving the cancer, I think it's significant, I can opt to submit that variant to ClinVar, and I can use this framework to say why I think that this variant is oncogenic. And what this framework does is it looks at the variant from 5 different perspectives. How often is that variant present in the population? If it's very common, it's less likely to be oncogenic. If it's rare, it's more likely to be oncogenic. What about functional data? Does the literature show that when you deliberately induce this mutation, into a test environment that it drives cancer. And then we have these other 5 swim lanes. Oops. And so given that, it turns out that it's feasible to create an algorithm using, using that particular framework. And this is an example of an open source decision support framework that we have a group of students working on now that will ultimately probably be done by the end of the year. It'll get donated to the molecular tumor board use case if people want to play with it. And it takes as input a variant and it outputs what the overall oncogenicity prediction is. And what we find here is that there's a range of annotations that are necessary. We need to know how the population data from NOMAD, we need to look at cancer hotspots, we need computational evidence. Functional data turned out to be particularly complicated because most of the evidence about in vitro or in vivo studies where we've deliberately introduced these variants, most of them are still in the literature and not aggregated into a structured database. And so here, for harnessing the functional data, we're finding that large language models that are adequately prompted and with and also supplemented with literature can do a remarkably beautiful job at synthesizing the literature and helping to determine the overall score for functional data and contributing to the overall score. So this is kind of where we want to go with the decision support stuff, but we feel like in order to get to this, we need to figure out, well, how am I going to get these annotations to you? Am I going to get them, where are these annotations going to go? So with that, I think BVO, I'm going to end.
Great. Thanks, Bob and Yuri. And appreciate the investment that you guys make in making the MTB use case team work and your experience and expertise here. There is an opportunity for questions. I put a note in the chat to say if any of the audience has questions for our presenters, please do put them in the chat. I haven't seen any of those questions arrive yet. And so what I think I will do is I will invite our second guest speaker, Lisa, to take the podium. And she has a shorter presentation on the work that she and her team have been doing around symptoms IG. And when that wraps up, then we'll go back to Q&A for both presentations. So audience, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat. And with that, I will invite Lisa Anderson to take the podium. Over to you.
Great, thanks, BVO. Hi, everyone. My name's Lisa Anderson. I'm a nurse by background and have been working in clinical informatics for about 20 years. I currently work for the National Quality Forum and Joint Commission as their principal clinical quality informaticist. And for the last couple of years, we've been working on a project around symptoms data standardization that arose from a Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation grant related to diagnostic excellence. And so when they were reviewing the literature related to diagnostic errors and patient harms, it became pretty apparent that diagnostic errors contribute to high costs and hinder diagnostic excellence. And it continues to be like a huge problem, not just in the United States, but globally as well. And so during that work, they decided to focus on symptoms. And the rationale behind that is because symptoms play a really crucial role in the diagnostic process. They represent what a patient is feeling or experiencing. And symptoms are often the initial reason for seeking treatment and can be an early indicator of underlying diseases. Symptoms often vary in description and specificity. They can be vague, nonspecific, and their presentation can change over time. Unfortunately, symptom data lacks standardization and uniformity, as well as consistent documentation. Which then hinders like effective communication, especially if a patient goes from like their primary care physician to a specialist or changes health systems. And so in order to help fix that problem, we wanted to standardize symptoms, both semantically and structurally, in a FHIR implementation guide. Before we even moved into HL7 as an official project, we did host 2 technical expert panels to gather the clinical data requirements and like kind of front load that information so that we already had enough information to move forward once we got into the technical space. And so we held those meetings in May of 2024 and October of 2024. Participants included physicians with experience in various clinical practices, research, informatics, as well as representation from a patient advocacy group. The output of those the clinical data requirements was this conceptual map that was our starting point for going into HL7. And so what you see here is in the middle, you have like the symptom. And then we wanted to, document what are the important elements or the things that you also need to ask about with relationship to the symptom to get the full context of what's going on with the patient. So just a couple examples are like, when did the symptom start? What's that date of onset? How long has it been going on? Is it how frequent is it? Is it every day? Is it intermittent, continuous, things like that? On the right-hand side, we have a lot more elements that we originally included in our conceptual model, wanting to tweeze out where in the body is the symptom occurring, what's the quality, severity, things like that. We took that conceptual model and went into HL7. We started the project, I think, back in March or April. And we fine-tuned the elements we had just a little bit before we went to the September Connect-a-thon. So by the time we got to the September Connect-a-thon, we wanted to really fine-tune what we had in our implementation guide. So we had a couple of questions for implementers about their terminology requirements and establishing more precise timing elements to ensure that it made sense within our model. We wanted to clarify the relationship between symptoms and diagnosis, and we wanted to review implementation practices. So we wanted to understand what are people already doing to help make sure that our model aligns with that as we move forward. At the HL7 Connect-a-thon, we did have participation from quite a few implementers. And I do want to note, this is a universal realm guide. We started with universal because we had active participants from the NICTICS team in the Netherlands who've done quite a bit of clinical information modeling around symptoms. And then the actual participants included Dynamic Health IT. They actually created a patient intake form for symptoms using using a FHIR-enabled app. They were able to connect with the Washington State Department of Health, Washington Department of State was able to connect to DHIT's app and query it. Apple participated with us. So Apple was participating with respect to their personal health record and what they have in Apple Health Kit. They do have a portion of that app does surround symptoms. And so they were able to connect to DHIT's app and query observations and also import the symptoms into their system. And then Smile Digital Health also participated. They created a use case around pain. And so they were able to create the symptom, post them to their Smile FHIR server, and get or search for the symptom. Lantana was involved in our track for the weekend. They are doing the work for the U.S. Public Health Library implementation guide. So they were interested in, can they reuse what we've already built from that aspect? And then InterSystems was, Russ Leftwich is my primary sponsoring co-chair that I work with. And so he gave us a demonstration on how we could use ClinFHIR and Graph Builder to generate some patient examples. So it was a really good event. We did modify our IG quite a bit after that testing event. It was duly noted that, we originally had our FHIR profile using FHIR R5. Every implementer at the table and on the phone was like, whoa, please go back to FHIR R4. We won't be able to implement it if you keep this, knowing that they're going to jump from FHIR R4 to R6. We fine-tuned our value sets and paired up Loink and SNOMED in our profile to use what implementers were were desiring. We also relaxed our must supports. We kind of had a must support on everything. And that was intentional going into the Connectathon because we wanted people to give a reaction to it. And they did. And they said, that would be really hard to reuse if you don't relax it. So we did make quite a few changes and just kind of fine tune that down to only requiring like the symptom and the observation category and a couple other things like that. And then we also collapsed triggers and exacerbating factors. So if you remember when you saw the conceptual model, those were two separate things. When we looked in symptoms trackers and implementations, every system we looked at had those collapsed because the answer list was the same and did some other fine tuning. We also found some issues. So originally we had our symptoms profile modeled using like the symptom as the observation and then using yes, no values. That was like noted as an issue for folks. And so we provided some options to move forward right after the Connectathon, like how can we handle this? Option one was like to model the symptom using a LOINC code called symptom and then have a SNOMED value set with like the common set of symptoms, or keep what we had and then talk through, there's some other information on here that's like just historical about what the personal health record group that's also trying to implement symptoms was doing and some stuff, but we gave some options for the path forward and regrouped with a good set of folks the following week after the Connectathon. So Simi was there to represent like, their concerns with how we had it modeled from a clinical interoperability perspective. TI was there, the terminology infrastructure folks, because they were helping us navigate. One, they were concerned about the modeling, and then two, the personal health record group that is working on a project, they are out of Japan and cannot use SNOMED CT like we use it in a lot of other places. And so they wanted to help navigate like, can we also, if we're using SNOMED answer list, can we also use a LOINC answer list and then look at how they can get the codes we have in our SNOMED CT value sets into the IPS extension. Patient empowerment was there because they're the sponsoring work group for personal health record project, and they're one of my co-sponsors. CIC, who's my sponsoring work group, had representation, and then myself and some others. And so we discussed like the challenge that we were having, and then talk through the options. And the big concern with the way that we had it modeled was that if implementers must query both the symptom code and the yes/no response with that approach. And if they only query the symptoms, it could be like misinterpreted that the patient positively has that symptom, and it becomes a patient safety concern and was also noted to be error prone. And so, they wanted us to do like that approach where you have symptom as the code and then SNOMED as the value set. And so we're like, okay, well, that's great. But how do we then note that like if a patient denies a symptom, like if you're asking them like, okay, you've been having dizziness, are you also having chest pain? And they say, no, how do you do that? And they said, oh, that's easy. Just create another profile for symptom absent, which is what we ended up doing. There was also some concerns raised about like our profile is very post-coordinated. There were concerns about like, well, what if people are doing that in a pre-coordinated fashion in their system? So we're actually right now this week writing up some guidance on how to handle that and putting in an example table to show how the mapping should work. But we're able to address all these issues and continue moving forward. So our next steps with this project are, we just got our notice of intent to ballot approved by CIC last month. We're working through our work groups and co-sponsoring work groups to get approval to go to ballot. We're continuing to work with the personal health record group because they do want to reuse the symptoms profile. And our plan is to hold the ballot cycle during the January 2026 cycle, which actually opens in December. And then we want to publish the IG by the end of March. We're also working through some policy levers in the United States to get comments submitted to ASTP to get symptoms added as a data class and the associated elements baked in there as well. My purpose for coming to CodeX, and we're also socializing this with quite a few other folks, is, we are seeking opportunities for other projects to leverage the work that the symptoms profile work has done. We built what we think is a great thing, and we could see a few different ways where it could be reused. I know I mentioned public health wants to reuse it with respect to like case reporting and syndromic surveillance. Personal health record wants to reuse it in that sense where the personal health record is collecting, symptoms data. But we think that there are additional use cases out there that we would like to fit into if feasible. And so that's why we're here, sharing the information and socializing a little bit to see if anyone gravitates towards it, because we really want to, get that connection with a group that's working with implementers to help continue moving this work forward. And with that, I'm done. I did include my contact information on this slide, and BVO, I can send you these slides afterwards so you can socialize them with the group, but
Absolutely.
I'll stop talking and open the floor.
Very good. All right, so thanks to all of our presenters. And I'm looking for questions in our chat. I see a couple of links here. Susan says, thank you. And a question, how are you considering how symptoms may be present but have a continuum of improving, declining, or staying the same? Susan indicates she has another project that she's worked on with a mobile health app. We found it was more than yes or no.
Yep. So we actually moved away for the symptom with the yes, no responses. So each symptom, when you document it, is an instance of that symptom, and then the elements that are associated with it. So we do have a data element for symptom trend, and so that's like gets at, is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Staying the same? We also have a clinical course, which is getting at like, is this acute, chronic, or acute on chronic, things like that. So it is a fairly enumerated IG with like all those attributes specified, and it is meant to be in the instance level so that as they change over time, you could use visualization to view that. And it also, we also have a reference to other symptoms as well as conditions if you want to associate the symptoms together, or to associate symptoms together or with a specific condition that the patient knows they have.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. We are approaching the top of the hour, and so I think I'll take this opportunity to say thank you once again to our speakers and presenters for your time and effort and preparation. As always, this meeting is recorded and will be published both to the Confluence site, CodeX's Confluence site, as well as to the CodeX YouTube page. So thank you all for attending and for your contribution to this space. And if any of our audience would like to get in touch with our speakers, feel free to reach out to me, and I will be happy to make those connections. And with that, folks, have a great weekend and happy Halloween, and we'll see you all at the next community of practice.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, BJ.